from now on.
Okay, yes, yes. So, good morning.
Good
This
morning.
is Good morning. This is Pushing Boundaries, a podcast about pioneering research, breakthrough discoveries, and unconventional ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas R. Verney. My guest today is Dr. Bob Rosenberg, who has a PhD from the university. Which university was it? It was in the
Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins. Okay. In the history of science and technology. He spent 2 decades at Rutgers University, then worked at John Wiley and Sons for some years. Bob has continued to pursue his interests as an independent scholar. He has contributed chapters to two very important books, Irreducible Mind in 2007
I
and the
should not irreducible mind. I was involved in its production, but I did not contribute a chapter.
Okay, correction taken. And what about Beyond Physicalism? Did you contribute
No,
to that?
I did not. Again, I was involved only in the discussions that led to its production.
Okay. And
But
then, yes,
the third one, Consciousness Unbound,
yes,
that I do have a chapter in.
wonderful. And that chapter is on precognition, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so let's start there. May I call you Bob?
Please.
Let's start there. What is precognition?
Well,
Take as much time as you like.
I mean, that's interesting. It is the cognition part implies that precognition is a little more than premonition, which is a preliminary warning, a monition. It's not what Dean Radin and Daryl Bem were studying, which was, thank you, now the word has gone from my head, but which is just the subliminal sense that of something that is going to happen.
Kind of vague, not definite, right? Vague.
Yes, and often not even specifiable,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that the work that Dean has done is, I don't mean to be overly familiar, but the work that he's done is only determined by statistical analysis, in the sense that the work that J.B. Rhine did for so long was determined after the fact by statistical analysis. Whereas precognition is something that has risen to consciousness. It might be a dream. The idea, the way people have approached this who've studied it, is that the information comes in subliminally, to use Meyer's term very deliberately. It comes in subliminally, and as it comes to consciousness, it is then recognizable as a vision or even a scent or a sound, but it's something conscious. And in coming to consciousness, as I see it,
Yes.
It acquires information or a slant or a take that is part of the personality of the person experiencing it. It is occasionally a precognitive episode involves something very clear, almost film-like. And when the event occurs, there it is, exactly as foreseen. But more often, it's a little vague around the edges, or it doesn't happen exactly as foreseen. And although that can be taken to mean that maybe there are probable futures and the percipient saw one, and in fact, a different one happened.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of how one can see a future that then doesn't happen because you've changed it
Mm-hmm.
is one of the fundamental questions about precognition. But shall I just go
Yes,
on?
yes, please. It's
Okay.
very interesting. Yes, go
There
on.
is there is an episode that Frederick Myers,
Yeah.
who was a principal figure in the Society for Psychical Research in England in the last 20 years of the 19th century, and wrote a magisterial work called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death.
Mm.
He related an episode that a woman related. She had had a dream, a very vivid dream, that her coachman had fallen off the coach and hit his head on the pavement, crushed his hat on the way back from a visit she had made. And the next day, when she was preparing to make that visit, she was very apprehensive about a coachman. And he assured her he was fine, and they went. And then on the way back, she could see other people on the street staring at her coachman. And so she told him to stop. She saw that he was pulling back hard on the reins for no apparent reason. She grabbed her child, jumped out, saw that he was swaying on the box on the front of the brougham, and called a policeman who caught him before he hit the ground. He never did crush his hat. He never did hurt his head. It turned out he was ill and dehydrated and just fainted, basically. There are several interesting things here. The principal one, of course, is that she foresaw something that didn't happen because she called the policeman over. However, they were going the wrong way on the street. They weren't going the way she had seen in the dream. So, are we to assume that this alternate future started when he went the different way on the street? It seems to me a much more reasonable interpretation of this episode, and in fact, almost all episodes where there's an intervention, that she had the vision of him falling off the box and hitting the street. She had the vision of him falling off the box. That happened. But the part about hitting the street and which way they were going on the street was supplied by her conscious mind as this information came up from her subliminal mind. And so it doesn't involve alternate futures. What it involves is her interpreting this information as it came up. Now, this is a given for apparitions, for ghosts, for all kinds of other phenomena in the field, where it's understood that there are two players. There's the person seen and the seer.
Mm-hmm.
That is the percipient and the agent, or
Yeah.
however one wants to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, sometimes one sees an apparition of a person wearing the actual clothes they are wearing. Sometimes one sees an apparition of someone in familiar clothes that have nothing to do with what they are wearing, or they have a beard, when in fact at the present time they don't have a beard, but the percipient was familiar with them with a beard. And the way this has been interpreted by people who have covered the field far better than I is that in fact we have the agent and the percipient, and they are contributing like a playwright and a director to what is being perceived. And it strikes me that that's what's happening in precognitive episodes.
So the episode that you described about the woman and her coachman,
Yes.
In my experience, I myself have not had any precognitive dreams or fantasies or whatever, but several of my friends have. And it seems that they have always occurred between people who are very, very close to each other, like a really meaningful relationship between these two people. So one person would dream about the other one, but they were very closely associated. Has that been your experience?
No.
No, no, that's okay. Yeah.
It's one of the fascinating things about precognition. It defies categorization. There
Mhm.
are utterly trivial episodes in a person's own life.
Mhm.
There are tremendously meaningful ones. One of my favorites, I seem to have a lot of favorites.
Yes.
I use this one in the chapter because it's striking.
Mhm.
A woman woke up. She was boarding in a small room in London. And she woke up, opened her eyes, and is facing a cabinet of drawers. All of a sudden, she sees in front of her this very vivid scene of two men. Now, she is a white English woman. She sees who grew up in India or spent part of her youth in India. She's now in England. She sees two dark men talking to each other, one of whom looks at her and has beautiful teeth, she notices. And then this man walks in front of them as she jumps out of bed,
Yeah.
knocks her head on a corner of the bureau, and when she opens her eyes, it's gone. Nothing. Gone. It was so striking that she told the people that morning at breakfast about it. And then when she went home to her family some days later, some time later, she told them. Years pass, and she's in India again, in the station, to use the British word, where she had grown up. She went to a club, as only the British have clubs. And as she walked in the door, there were those two guys standing in front of the same fireplace. And she stopped, and a man walked in front of them, and she just started in the old sense. He was
Yeah.
startled, and
Startled.
she bumped into someone who laughingly asked, as had happened in her little vision, why she was so eager to get. Anyway, she learned that these two guys were students at Eton when she had the vision. The club hadn't even been built. It meant absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
And it was clear as a bell. And she was mystified about why it happened,
Yeah.
but if it had any meaning, because it didn't. Um, and it's good to have things like that. Now, my general approach
Yes.
to psi, maybe to life, I don't know, is is a sort of negative way. Not this, not this. And in the case of precognition, theories, every theory I've encountered founders on some case or other
Mm.
that simply refuses to fit a given understanding of the phenomena. And I think the reason for that
Yes.
is that in theorizing, people are working from concepts of time, personality that are commonsensical
Mhm.
and clearly wrong from the phenomena.
Mhm.
If we start with a phenomena and look at what happens, ordinary time has to go out the window. I quote half a dozen or 8 people from Ian Stevenson and Myers and Mrs. Sidgwick, Eleanor Sidgwick, Robert Thulis, people who spent a lot of time looking at this. Sooner or later, they all say, well, if we can't make sense of this with our concepts of time, so much the worse for our concepts of time.
Right.
And I think that's true. There's so much evidence
Mhm.
that the nature of time needs to be utterly rethought if
Mhm.
we are to make any sense of this at all.
Well, at a meeting in June of this year, you gave a paper, Probing Causality and the Nature of Time. Um, and in it, you say, between case histories and recent experimental work, it is clear that we must take precognition seriously. So
Yeah.
could you tell me a little bit about the experimental work that would support precognition as a serious subject to study?
Okay. Um, J.B. Ryan, in his work in his laboratory, which he very deliberately narrowed to ESP cards.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, I have some. I could hold them up.
Sure,
Um,
sure. Let's do
anyway,
that. Yeah, sure.
well, let me. Now that I've said that, ah, um,
Mm-hmm.
he
Yes.
had these developed, and people would guess them. Here's one. Those
Okay,
are
got it.
waves,
Yes.
right? And I feel like I'm doing a card trick.
Okay.
This is the cross.
Yes.
I've nicely arranged these so they all make sense.
Okay.
Then there's a square. So the waves, the cross, the square, a circle,
Yes.
and a star.
Got it.
The idea being that they're different enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh, and he would have people guess these one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
There's a deck of 25,
Mm-hmm.
and he might just put the deck down on the table
Mm-hmm.
and say, tell me what order they're in.
Mm-hmm.
Or he might turn them over one at a time without looking at them, or and have the same time have someone look at them.
Right. So that would
So,
be more ESP than precognition, right? That would be
yes,
extrasensory perception,
that's telepathy or
telepathy.
clairvoyance.
Yeah. Right.
And then he tried saying, well, okay, guess the order of a deck of cards that we're going to shuffle tomorrow,
Ah.
right? The problem is that when you do that, you have the possibility that someone is messing with the shuffling. If you were to allow psychokinesis, PK, which he also experimented with largely with dice,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Throw
Yeah.
20, 25 dice
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
see if you could affect the outcome.
Yeah.
What happened was a fellow named Bob Morris did
Yeah.
an article that basically tore into, I don't mean to make it sound that adversarial. He analyzed all the work that Ryan had done with precognition and said there was pretty much nothing that couldn't be explained by a combination of clairvoyance, telepathy, psychokinesis, and the laboratory work that Ryan did was only so good.
Mm-hmm.
Then we started getting work more sophisticated stuff. Instead of using cards, they used images. It was a famous dream telepathy study at Maimonides Laboratory in Brooklyn. Montague Ullman and Chuck Honerton and Stan Krippner. And then Chuck Honerton started working on something that he called Gansfeld work. And it could be used for telepathy or clairvoyance, but it could also be used precognitive.
Huh?
Gansfeld means whole field, and they would put ping pong ball halves on someone's eyes, put
Yes.
them in a very relaxing chair, in a
Yes.
very relaxing room
Yes.
with nice music or
Yes.
not, and bathe their faces in gentle red light,
Yes.
so that all they saw was this whole red field, their eyes open. And then they were supposed to get impressions of images,
Yes.
not just cards, but images.
Images.
And their response when they, what did you see? Well, I had a feeling I was in a field. There was a river. There was a camel. Whatever there was. Yeah, well, you know how people are about
Yes.
camels.
Yes.
Um, and that it had the advantage of, first of all, moving away from simple cards and having images, which
Yes.
people seem to be quite good at, and also getting away from precognitive work, spontaneous work in dreams, which are problematic in a lot of ways. Getting reports. I don't know about you, but my dreams are hideously nonsensical and nonlinear, and only occasionally can I pull anything from them that's coherent. But some people have nice
Yes.
linear narrative
Right.
dreams.
Like a short story.
I envy them, but they can do better with the precognitive stuff. Anyway, some of Chuck Honerton's work, the Gansfeld work, was precognitive. Then Dean Radin started working on, the word was presentiment that I was looking for, which is more of a feeling, a sentiment.
Right.
And he had people sit in front of a computer and they were to guess, for example, which side of the screen was going to have a pleasant image as opposed to an unpleasant one, or vice versa.
Right.
Often, for his work, often enough, the target wasn't chosen until after the subject, we'll say, made the choice. You can do that with a computer. It's very easy. Computers are fast.
Right.
Right. So you press the button, the computer makes a choice and shows you. Okay. A man named Darrell Bem, who was an internationally renowned psychologist at Cornell and a proponent, quietly, of psi research, replicated those experiments, 9 different flavors of this experiment, and found that, in fact, there were very strong statistical effects, undeniable, significant. When that hit the news in 2011, there were people who were quite sure it was the end of science in full caps. It wasn't. But there was tremendous upset and anger. In fact, there were people who felt that maybe we should stop using statistical significance at all, because look what it resulted in. This kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
Now, another line of research was started out at the Stanford Research Institute, 60s and 70s. A man named Russell Targ and his co-experimenter Hal Puthoff. And they were experimenting with what they called remote viewing, which was effectively clairvoyance, or maybe telepathy, and often precognitive, in which someone in a laboratory, you're in the laboratory as the agent,
Mm-hmm.
and they found people who were very gifted at this. Someone once said that if you want to have, a fellow out at Stanford said, if you want to win the high jump with your track team, you don't get 7 people who can jump 1 foot. You get 1 person who can jump 7 feet.
Uh-huh.
And Target Putoff found they sifted.
Yeah.
They found some very talented people who were astounding at this. And sometimes it involved you're sitting here with me, you're the talented fellow, I'm the experimenter with you, and we send 2 other people out, and they get out and they open an envelope that has been randomly selected, and they follow that and go to the place, and then they sit there for 5 minutes while you try to tell me where they are, or what, not even where they are, you tell me your impressions
Mm-hmm.
of what's going on.
Right.
And those were just as good. There was another group doing it at Princeton. There's just as good when it's in the here and now and in the then and there. It might be that you give me your impressions and the target is selected in 3 hours or tomorrow or next week,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or in Paris
Mm-hmm.
or in Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
All seem to be fairly irrelevant. Distance and time had little effect on the results that these people could acquire. 2 examples. There was an episode where they were given the latitude and longitude of a very specific place.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it was the vacation home of a professor, and it was in the hills in Virginia. And what they came up with was in fact about a quarter mile away, and it was a hidden NSA bunker, much to the unamused reception that it got from the people who had asked them, because this was all being done for the intelligence community.
Uh-huh. Right.
They really wanted to know
Yes.
if there was anything in this.
Yes. Yes.
And there
Yeah.
are books about it now. The cordon has been removed, and a lot of it is no longer classified. So
So,
there's
so what is your working hypothesis as to an explanation for how these things work uh, scientifically, if that's possible at all?
I don't think it is. Certainly not yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think an understanding of this is going to have to get beyond the simple insanity that we find in pre and retro cognition.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in fairness, there are people who see the past as readily as they see the future. Now, the past somehow doesn't seem as bothersome,
Mm-hmm.
since we know it's already happened and we're used to the idea of memory. The problem is that when these people have these perceptions, they're exactly the same as their precognitive experience, except it's in the past. They're seeing things from a third person point of view. There was a man named Stefan Osiewicz in the 20th century, a Polish psychic, who was astonishing. Tested again and again and again, same kinds of results. But you would give him a letter in an envelope. You might not know anything about it. He would take it and he would hold it and he would rub it in his hands and he'd walk up and down for 2, 3, 15 minutes. And then he would tell you about the person who wrote it, about the room they wrote it in, about the people who interrupted him, about what he was having for lunch. And he would tell you their states of mind. He would tell you things that just, well, I say they were out of the ordinary. it's all rather out of the ordinary. But that is as extraordinary as anything precognitive, right? He's putting himself in a location he's never been, with people he's never met, he knows nothing about. He might as well be seeing something in a year in the future, and he's not. So
I've had experiences like that. Yes. Yes. I once remember seeing a patient for the first time, and he told me about these extraordinary talent that he has, and I kind of looked skeptical, and he said, "Give me your wallet, please." So I gave him my wallet, and after a few minutes he started describing my home that he had never seen, and then he continued describing the inside of the home. Then he went to describe the living room. Then he described the grand piano by the window. And then he said, "If I'm going to be your patient, I don't want to see anymore."
that's interesting, because of course usually it's the doctor who takes the patient's wallet.
Right? Oh,
That's a different
good.
problem.
That's very good.
But okay, now you've touched on something that is related, and I bring up one particular episode, another favorite, having to do with what's called psychometry, right? The reading of objects.
Yes.
You give the gypsy your watch, and she tells you,
Yeah.
then you never get your watch back, because
Right.
after all, we know how gypsies are.
Careful.
Careful. Well, in this episode, a man named Asti, a Frenchman, in the early part of the 20th century, was working with half a dozen very gifted, he called them sensitives, for about a dozen years. One of them, someone came to see him one day, knowing that he had these people around. And this person said, "Look, I live on this big estate. And in France, there are big estates that are very regular. They're just forested.
Yeah.
They're flat. Hundreds of acres, perhaps.
Yes.
Dozens anyway. This old man, it was wintertime, he lived in a small house by himself, and he disappeared. And everyone was worried that he'd wandered off and gotten lost and died. "Well," said the sensitive, "can you bring me something of his?" So person came back with a scarf that had been in the cabinet
Yes.
at the guy's house.
Yes.
And the medium took it, the sensitive took it and held it for a while, and they said, "Okay." He left the house and he turned left and he walked down the road about a quarter mile and went into the woods, and he's fallen and he's lying in a small clearing with these big rocks, and described it. They went to look and they couldn't find it. They came back and they said, "Can you be more specific? Because it's too regular. We can't specify the place." So they got a more specific reading. They looked again and they couldn't find it. Came back. "Can you do better?" Okay. She did better. They went out. I'm sorry, I think it was a male sensitive. They went out, and this time they found it
Yes.
in that environment with the rocks in the clearing and all that. Now, what happened? Because he wasn't wearing that scarf. It was in his house, just sitting in the cabinet while he was out getting lost and dying and lying on the ground. So the idea of psychometry, like your wallet, as somehow containing that information doesn't wash. But what Asti felt was that we all contain our lives, past, present, future. And when we have things that are close to us, or even sometimes that we just touch, they can be used as a conduit to get back to us. Now, this guy was dead, so it's even more complicated than that. But that was his basic idea. We contain our lives, and things that we possess, that we touch, that we hold, can be used to get to us and to all that information.
So how did you, who started with a BA in history and science from Harvard University, right?
Right.
And then you got a master's in physical sciences from Stanford University.
Yes.
And then you worked at Rutgers University, I believe, for 20 years under staff of the Thomas E. Edison papers.
Yes.
So how did you move from that, which seems so far away from what we have been talking? How did you move from there into this whole other mysterious field of precognition and all the other stuff?
Well, the truth is, I don't have the fortitude of people like Ed Kelly and Dean Radin and Bob Morris and Bill Roll to completely commit myself to the field. When I was at the aforesaid Harvard, January of my senior year, one of my friends came back from the library and said, you know, I was at the library and I saw a journal of parapsychology. And I said, really? Because I'd heard of Rhine, but I assumed that it all ended. This is 1972,
Right.
January. I assumed it had all ended long before.
Right.
And the idea that there was a journal I found astonishing. So I went up to the library, and by God, there wasn't one, there were 3 or 4 right there. Now, it was my good luck to be at Harvard for 2 reasons. One is Harvard's library has almost everything. I mean, it's really in a class with the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress. It's an astonishing collection of millions of items. So they had those journals. And then I went back into the stacks. At this point, I didn't know about William James' connection to the field, though I found out. But there was a collection of several thousand volumes on the shelf. And I started reading.
Huh.
And I read some very good stuff and I read some nonsense.
Right.
It took a while, as often happens when you dip into this field, to figure out which was which.
Right.
That the guy writing this book was some fraud up in Montreal,
Right.
who'd never been any of the places he said, and that the woman writing this book, Eileen Garrett, was one of the most gifted mediums of the 20th century and had been studied and vetted and all that. But eventually I got a better idea of what was real. And then in May, I saw a little notice on a bulletin board saying that that evening in this room, there would be a demonstration of, God help me, I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was basically a demonstration of parapsychology. And I went. And a fellow named Ed Kelly was accompanying a fellow named Billy Delmore. Ed had gotten his PhD the year before at Harvard in psycholinguistics and gone to work down at Rhine's lab for reasons which he has described here and there. And Billy Delmore was a student at Yale Law School and was sent down to Ed by a fellow named Irv Child, with whom Ed had studied at Yale. And because Billy had wanted to take a year out from law school and find out a little more about himself as a psychic, Ed brought him up to Harvard because the Harvard psychology department had something called the Hodgson Fund, which had been started by William James. And Ed wanted to get some money to support Billy for a year down at Rhine's lab, which he did, despite the fact that B.F. Skinner was just, no, he was still there, I think, until 74. And he was in William James Hall, which is amusing in its own way. But Ed came up with Billy, and Billy was mind-blowing. There were about 30 people, 30 students in the room, and Billy just was Billy. Billy just did things. Um, Hard to describe what they were like, but being around him
Yes.
was upsetting. And so that summer, after some thought, I went to the Parapsychological Association meeting, which was in Edinburgh. I found my way over there and I met the people in the field, and I was duly and properly astonished. And I wound up going down to North Carolina. Bill Roll invited me to work down at the Psychical Research Foundation, which was a spinoff from Ryan's lab that was devoted to the question of survival, of some aspect of human personality. And I was there for about a year and a half, 2 years. Then I got married and I left. And those were life altering years for me. I went from being a good materialist scientist to being a completely mystified human being. I still believe that 1 and 1 was 2 and all that, but I also didn't believe for a second that what I'd been taught about a human being was correct, because Billy was down there. I spent a lot of time with him, a great deal of time with Ed Kelly, Jim Carpenter, Bob Morris. I could drop names till the cows came home. But I then took what I had learned and tried to digest it. I wound up out in California. My wife and I moved out there, and I wound up almost by accident at Stanford with a wonderful older fellow whose picture is up there, but you can't see it, who was extraordinarily tolerant, chemist who was about to retire. And then after that, I went to Hopkins, and it rapidly became clear I was not going to be able to do any work with psychical research, parapsychology, or anything like that. So I got a degree and I went to work at the Edison papers, but I remained friends with a number of people, stayed in contact, went to a association meeting every 5 or 7 or 8 years. And then when I got out to California in 2001, Ed Kelly contacted me because they were trying to digitize Myers, the 2-volume set. And I had done a great deal of that at the Edison papers. And Ed knew that. And he got in touch with me. And so I helped them with that. He had been involved. He and his wife, Emily, and Mike Murphy, had a couple of other people had started Sursem, the survival seminar out at Essalen in 98, I believe. And I got involved through the work on the digitization, and then I was invited to participate, which I did for 11 years. And that was more fun. That was so much fun. It probably should have been illegal. It was what we'd all like graduate school to be, a week-long intensive seminar where the conversation never stopped, and you had people from literally, well, if not around the world, certainly from across the northern part of it. Some people from, I believe we had a couple of people from Brazil one year, but physicists, psychologists, psychiatrists, students of religion, philosophers. It was fantastic. And it resulted in those 3 books. There they are, up there.
Yes.
The
Nice.
Reducible Mind and Beyond Physicalism,
Mhm.
and Consciousness Unbound, which Ed really spearheaded with a tremendous amount of work from other people.
So what does life look like to you ahead of you? Like what's on your plate for the next 10 years?
Wow. Well, right now, I've had this interesting opportunity. The man I studied with at Hopkins is retiring, and another professor who worked with him is retiring. And so their students are putting together, pardon my German, a Fettschrift,
Yes.
that is a celebratory
Hmm.
collection of essays by their students. They worked together and individually for some time on the idea of place in science, both the laboratory, what a laboratory is like. This is something that has occupied historians of science for some time now and borders on the sociology of science, the philosophy of science, and even technology. But the internal workings of a laboratory, the situation, financial and physical of a laboratory, the larger setting, Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Boston, attempts to replicate those things in other countries. So there's a great deal that has been written and that can still be written.
Hmm.
Well, I had two choices. I could do Edison, who
Yes.
invented research and development in his laboratory, but a great deal has been written about him by some very competent historians,
Hmm.
and most of what I might say could probably be inferred from what they've done. Whereas I could also write something about Ryan's laboratory when he started. And the most interesting thing about place in Ryan's laboratory is it was very hard to figure out where the walls were when you had subjects who could be moved 100 feet, 100 yards, or a mile and a half, and you still got the same results.
Hmm.
And yet you wanted to maintain this scientific air of
Hmm.
the laboratory.
Right.
Anyway, with the release of Ryan's letters in the last year and books that have been written about him and about his laboratory and about the work in general, I think, given that this will just be a paper and not a book. That's first. That's first.
And second?
Second is something I've had a lot of trouble getting myself really engaged with, although
Yeah.
God knows I want to do it. And that is, I want to do a book on the field for young adults.
Ah. Uh-huh.
Before, as Ed Kelly said, before hardening of the categories sets in.
Or hardening of the arteries.
Right. Well, when I was a kid, about 7 years old, my parents gave me a book called Our Friend the Atom. And it
Oh.
was a Disney book. There was going to be some kind of feature film made that was never made. But it was 1957, and the atom was still very scary. And the idea that you might be able to use atomic energy in a peaceful way was a hard sell in a lot of quarters. And that I'm reading back into this. I don't know actually about the book, but reading it now as an adult, that's what I see. That they're trying to persuade the reader that yes, we know how it has been used, but it can be better than that. And I was utterly taken by this. This was a great introduction to science for me. And I want to do that for kids. I want to write a book about the development of the field. If there's anything I learned in college, it was that the history of science is a great way to really engage with the deep meaning of science. And I
So
would like to write a historical introduction to the field.
mm, sounds
So,
wonderful. Sounds wonderful. So you have come, well, you have had a very interesting journey. I mean, you've had a very interesting life, dipping into all kinds of sciences and parapsychology, much more metaphysical. So my question is, what have you learned about yourself during this journey?
wow, that's the years. in my 2 years in North Carolina, right after college, I did a tremendous amount of yoga, 3, 4 hours a day. I was meditating once, twice, even 3 times a day. I had known the woman I married since we were 16. And finally, I think I grew up enough for her to marry me. So I learned a lot about myself in those years. And I've always said I recommend anybody to take a couple years off after college and really just spend your time thinking
Mm-hmm.
and encountering people and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, my God, that was really the formative developmental stuff. That was, what exactly do I think I am? And as
Yes,
I said,
exactly. Exactly.
my inclination is to go the negative way.
Mm.
And I have a pretty good idea what I'm not, but I really don't know. Um, it's been, I am, I am pretty sure that something happens when and after one dies. I think the evidence is extremely strong. I don't know, you're probably aware of the Bigelow contest that took place over the last couple of years. I think some of the essays submitted for that were very clear and very strong, very good.
Yes.
Um, I think the evidence is pretty clear.
Yes.
I've learned that you can't go stand on the corner and talk about it. In fact, it can be really hard to talk about on an individual level. My father died a few years ago, and he knows what I've been doing all these years. And at one point, a couple of weeks before he died, he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised." But the problem is, even with that evidence, forget precognition, there are so many ways to interpret the mediumistic information, the near death experiences, the reincarnation information. What you can do is amass this evidence and see that it points to something.
Mm-hmm.
But exactly what is very hard to say. I would say that I envy people who've arrived at some certainty, but I don't really,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that to arrive at certainty in these matters, you have to ignore other evidence.
Right. I
And I
totally
don't
agree.
think that's a good thing. Saying that something exists
Mm-hmm.
and saying that you understand it are
Right.
two very different things. And
Yes.
I think there is no doubt that precognition and the other phenomena that parapsychologists, psychical researchers have studied, there's no doubt that those things are real. What they mean beats me, and I just hope we can find a way to investigate it. For precognition, it's time. I think we have to elevate the epistemological status of mystical experience
Mm-hmm.
so that people take it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes near death experiences and all kinds of things. But there's a kernel of important truth about time buried in there. We have to get to it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We could go on for many more hours, and I
It's
think
a
I would
it's a delight. It's a delight.
thank you. Thank you. I think I would like to do this again if it's okay with you, perhaps in a few months to revisit this subject.
Okay.
Would that be okay?
It would be okay. You're asking an academic to talk. That's that's easy. Um, I will have to. We'll maybe set this up so I won't just be repeating myself.
No, no, of
Uh,
course not. Of course not.
but
Well, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for the opportunity. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. And let me just say that next week, my guest will be Dr. Gerard D. Say Kuiken. He's the author of Eastern Thought and the Shiva Sutra of Vasugurupta. And we shall discuss some interesting questions which go very much along our discussion today. Some of the questions we'll be discussing is, what is thought? What is space-time? What is life-death? So please tune in. And thank you again, Dr. Rosenberg. Thank you.
My pleasure.